Sure. Come.
We're on. We can start.
Yeah, wait a minute. Just let me drink a coffee and I'm here. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us. My best wishes for 2023. Feliz Año Nuevo por Manuel y por Jenny and Texas. So I'm going essentially to try to say a few things as a follow-up of the previous presentation, and also a few things that are already said in the seminar, in the Anthropocene seminar, but with a few additional items. So it should be interesting, even for those who already followed the seminar on the Anthropocene seminar. So the introduction is, do we need a big or a grand narrative? Because what I'm going to suggest is that there are ways today to try to have a kind of synthetic narrative of what's happening, of what happened in the past 2 centuries, let's say, in Western countries. And in trying to do so, we have to face a number of challenges. One, which is the fact that for a long time already, you have a number of people who claim that this is just impossible. So one of them, whom I like very much, is Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno from the Frankfurter Schule in Germany after the Second World War, who essentially said after Auschwitz, it's no longer possible to believe that, Enlightenment is going to provide us with progress, and technological progress goes hand in hand with, let's say, the progress of civilization, because the rationality that flourished in the 18th century also led to the concentration camps. But actually, you have also this, as I was made aware a short time ago, this was already an argument put forward by someone like Paul Valéry after the First World War, actually, and also by Jean-François Lyotard, whom I don't know actually, or almost don't know, in his book on the postmodern condition. Essentially, he tries to, if I correctly understand, and in there, I guess, Anne, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, he tries to make the argument that both the Kantian narrative of enlightenment and also the Marxist narrative are both obsolete in the 80s, and this is what he calls the postmodern condition. At the same time, even though we face these kind of challenges, which all, I believe, boil down to saying all we can do is just to have a small number of scattered aphorisms, in the sense Nietzsche would do it, so you no longer have a big narrative, but you have some aphorisms, of wisdom, be it prophetic wisdom in the sense of Nietzsche. But then at the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are a number of people who already are developing grand narratives, especially on the side of neoclassical economists. So one, I think, very famous example is the book by North, Wallis and Wengast, and you may know that North got the Nobel Award, which is called Violence and Social Orders, a conceptual framework for interpreting recorded human history. So it's a grand vision where essentially the 3 economists who claim to be institutional economists, or to deal with institutions, essentially they wrap up everything, the history of civilizations, by saying that there are 3 main steps in civilizations, and there is a kind of teleological order. So step 1 must lead to step 2, step 2 must lead to step 3. Step 3 is the US, essentially, so that's the ideal society. Why? Because it's a free market. Step 2 is almost equivalent to imperfect competition. So it's a country where you have imperfectly working institutions, and the way imperfect competitions are understood is essentially the same as imperfect competition. So imperfect institutions are to the US what imperfect competition is to perfect competition in their understanding of history. So there are frictions, there is a little bit of corruption, there are people who don't have all the information, so there is asymmetry of information, these kind of things. But ideally, time unfolding, every society in the second step should enter the magnificent era of the third step, which is the US. And the first step is actually competitive societies, like hunter-gatherers, all these kind of savages before essentially they discovered the joyful life of competition. So of course, I mean, when anthropologists read this, they just laugh because this has almost nothing to do with reality. It's a completely ideological reframing of our history, but it's written by very prominent economists. And so they don't hesitate to write grand narratives. And the question is, can we just let them do the job in our place? So maybe we can't actually, because if we don't do the job, they do it. And then our imaginary is full of these kind of completely crazy narratives. And last but not least, at the same time, there are a number of European thinkers who tried already to write some grand narratives. Of course, one of them very famous is Michel Foucault in France. Also Marcel Gauchet, probably less known, but very important, I believe. You know, his book on Le Désenchantement du Monde. Giorgio Agamben is doing exactly the same today in Italy. So there are a number of people who already try to write grand narratives. So maybe it's time now to try to do it again. When trying to do this, it seems to me one starting point might be the fact that there are a number of people who are observing that there is a lot of resentment in our societies today. One guy who does this is Pankaj Mishra, who is a Hindu intellectual living in the UK, in London, I believe, who wrote this very interesting book in 2017, Age of Anger, where he claims that, so it's not ressentiment, it's resentment. I don't know why it's written in French. So he claims that there is something common to, let's say, people, young people in sub-Saharan Africa who enter into Boko Haram groups. Also, extremist Hindus in India who just follow Narendra Modi, or people who vote for Le Pen in France or Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and also people who vote for Trump in the US. And his main argument is to say, well, all these people are highly frustrated, are deeply frustrated. Why? Because globalization has spread out the idea of equality, of the ideal of an egalitarian society, and which is, so to say, legacy of enlightenment, for sure, but at the same time has betrayed this ideal. So it's as if you would give a child the idea of something beautiful, and at the same time you betray it and you make it impossible. So of course the child would be very, very resentful. So it's essentially this argument, I believe, that Pankaj Mishra is putting forward, saying that unless we have a new type of enlightenment which does not betray its own ideal, then this resentment cannot go up, cannot disappear. And if you think about it, this is somewhat reminiscent of the beautiful book by Karl Polanyi in the 40s, which is called The Great Transformation, where Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian economist back then, had another argument, but which, as you will see, is somewhat related, saying that the reason why Europe had these totalitarian regimes, namely the Third Reich in Germany and also USSR in Russia, is due to the fact that the first globalization, let's say liberal globalization at the end of the 19th century in Europe, led by the UK, has promoted the destruction of the social bond insofar it has privatized the three basic goods, which are the earth, let's say ecological services or however you want to name it, the earth, labor, and money. So his main argument is to say, in a society, as soon as you try to privatize these three basic goods, earth or energy, matter, whatever, nature, earth, labor, you turn labor into a private commodity. And it's true that most neoclassical economists think in terms of labor as a private commodity, and money has been privatized, for instance, in the Eurozone. Money is no longer in the hand of the states. Then you destroy the social bond, because this privatization makes it impossible to have a, let's say, peaceful socialization process within a society. And as a consequence, there is a lot of social suffering, according to Karl Polanyi. And this social suffering calls for an end of these crazy attempts to privatize everything. And back then, in the 20s in Italy, in the 30s in Germany, etc., the call was for a totalitarian regime, a right extreme regime that would put an end to this attempt to privatize everything. Of course, this probably echoes what's happening today. I believe we are exactly in the same kind of situation with the second wave of globalization, which is not just now for Europe, but for the entire planet. And then we could ask the question, and this will be my main starting hypothesis, is it possible that an excess of privatization in the way we observe it today in this globalization that started in the 80s at the world level, can this lead to some tribal reflexes? These tribal reflexes having led to the totalitarian regimes in the 20s, 30s in Europe, and today leading to phenomena like Trump, the 6th of January, Narendra Modi, etc., etc. So that's the starting question. So for that purpose, we need to understand what the tribal means, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because it's I believe, a category which is not studied as it should, at least for the literature that I know. So, and of course, by doing so, I also refer implicitly to the 4 categories that are studied by Elinor Ostrom. You remember that? So there's the private, the public, the common, and what she calls network goods, which I rebaptize tribal goods. So the tribal category, in the way I suggest you understand it, has a kind of German flavor, or I like to think in these terms. So it has something to do with what we in German call Stamm. The Stamm, it's the tribe, but it's also the trunk of a tree. So it's something which is growing organically. There is no big plan. It's endogenous. It's an endogenous growth, organic, which has something to do with nature. So which started before you and which will last after you, no matter what, which is inherited to a certain extent. You cannot change it, and which is very strong. So to a certain extent, we could say stemming topics, themes, gained some momentum in Germany after the defeat of Jena, 1806, or as you may remember, the French army defeated the Prussian army, which was a big surprise for the quote unquote Germans, because Germany did not exist back then. So, and this was to a certain extent the starting point of a revival within quote unquote Germany of a kind of conservative thinking against the French Enlightenment, where you had a number of German intellectuals saying, well, these fucking French, they have invented, the French Revolution and all this democracy and all these crazy ideas, but we have to go back to the truth of nature, because nature doesn't lie. So let's go back to the so-called Schwarzwald in German, the Black Forest, where we have communion with nature, with our ancestors, with the spirit, and all these kind of ideas, which of course are also, on the one hand, beautiful. I mean, if you think of Wagner, Richard Wagner is full of this kind of imaginary, and also very, very frightening, because obviously there is also a political impact of these kind of ideas, which might be very, very violent, actually. So, and that's the ambiguity of tribalism, okay? So, and then, of course, and that's exactly what some German intellectuals did in the 19th century, romantic people, I mean, within Romanticism, they went back to the history of Europe after the fall of the Latin Roman Empire, and before the Gregorian Revolution, to which I shall return in a few minutes. So back then, during these few centuries, between, let's say, the 6th century and the 11th century, Europe was essentially Frankish in German, meaning that it was shaped by small tribes, as opposed to the big Roman Empire, shaped by tradition. So you don't change tradition unless you are the charismatic leader who is allowed to change tradition, because he's in communion with the deities, with God, with the ancestors, or whatever. But normal people cannot change tradition. And there is a lot of violence, in the sense that if someone kills a member of your tribe, you are allowed to kill that someone. And you are even forced to do it, because otherwise you're not a good member of the tribe, this kind of thing. So you have blood, feud, vengeance. Honor is a very important value also. So you have to save the honor of your tribe, of your clan, of your family, etc. And very often it is very, very patriarchate type of society. So there is a man I like very much, Harold Berman, who is a great historian of law, who wrote a book half of it is dedicated to this kind of very fascinating societies where you don't have law, essentially. Law does no longer exist, disappeared with the Roman Empire, and would re-emerge with Gregorian Reformation. But nevertheless, it's a fascinating, highly sophisticated type of society, which is essentially tribal. One guy who, and that's not a surprise that it's Carl Schmitt, who tried, I believe, to think speculatively in terms, what the tribe means in relationship to the state, it's Carl Schmitt. So, as you know, Carl Schmitt was a lawyer and also a philosopher, and to a certain extent, a theologian, even though he was not trained as a theologian. And he is very ambiguous in the sense that for a certain, during certain year, certain number of years, he was the one of the organic intellectual, if I can say so, of the Third Reich during the 30s. And he's famous for a number of books. One on, politische Theologie in the 20s, and also the concept of the political, the Begriff des Politischen in German in the 30s. So his main statements, which are very famous, are the following. According to him, the sovereignty or the sovereign is the guy who decides on the state of exception, the guy who decides what you do above the law. So the 49.3 article in France is a way to implement sovereignty above the law, saying, I don't care about parliamentary law and democratic discussion. I just want to impose my will. That's it. So, so that's one aspect. The second aspect is the political distinction, according to him, between friends and enemies is the cornerstone of a polity. So a political community exists wherever a group of people are willing to engage in political life by distinguishing themselves from outsiders, enemies, through drawing of a friend-enemy distinction. So that's this made him very famous. And I believe that's, so to say, the definition of a tribal understanding of politics. As soon as you start thinking the politics in terms of there are friends, the members of my tribe, and there are enemies, the outcasts, those who are not members of one tribe, then you are in a tribal understanding of politics. And of course, you are immediately saying, for this to make sense, well, if you're not a member of my tribe, I can use violence against you. That's legitimate, just because you're not a member of my tribe. Okay. And then the third statement, which is very famous by Carl Schmitt, is that all key concepts of the modern doctrine of the state are actually secularized theological concepts, which suggests that a political theory that continues to use these concepts needs a theological foundation. So to say, he belongs to those thinkers who believe that the concept of the state as such is a theological concept. It's not a secularized concept, or actually is the secularized version of the theological concept. And in the French context, Marcel Gauchet is definitely also a member of this kind of people who understand it this way. So now, if you try to look more at the tribe from a, let's say, sociological viewpoint, and not so much a philosophical viewpoint as Carl Schmitt, then probably I think a very interesting book is the one recently published in 2020 by Isabel Wilkerson, who is an African-American intellectual in the US, where she has also a very interesting argument, which is to say there is something common between India, the caste system in India, the Third Reich in Germany, and the US, racism and slavery in the US. And this is what she claims, what is common between these three countries is the fact that all of them are based on a caste system. And for the argument to hold water, she has to describe and to explain what a caste is, according to her. So I'm just going to go through the criteria. I'm not going to discuss them. We don't have time for that, but it's very interesting to discuss them as well. So the first criterion is that I already alluded to is the fact that she says the social hierarchy in a tribe is beyond human control. You cannot change it, as I said, unless you are a charismatic leader. If you're a commoner, you're a normal guy, a mortal citizen, if I can say so, you cannot change it. Why? Because people will tell you this has been imposed by, divine will, by the gods, by the deities, by whoever. So that's the first thing. Second thing, it's heritable. So that's the heritability of the social status. It is acquired at birth and it's immutable. So it's obvious in the Indian caste, it's obvious in the Third Reich. If you are an Aryan guy or if you're a Jew, it's acquired at birth and you cannot change it forever. Things are less clear for handicapped people in the Third Reich, but I don't know how they would explain this. But no matter, never mind. And it's also, if you think of this, I mean, she mentions this at length, the US one drop rule. I don't know whether you're aware of that. If you have one drop of quote unquote black blood, you are black. I mean, this was the case in the US, at least until the 20s. And so you had these kind of discrimination laws trying to ask for the genealogy of everybody, at least for the parents, the grandparents, the third generation before you, etc., to try to hunt whether you would have some black ancestors. And if there would be at least one, then you would be declared as being black. So this is typical of this heritability of the social status that is, according to her, the hallmark of a caste system. Then endogamy, the prohibition of sex and marriages between castes. So you had, of course, the same thing in the US in the 18th century. So quote unquote, white people and African-American people could not have sex together, or this would be prohibited. You have the same story, of course, in Germany or in India, in caste system in India. Then fourth, and I believe this is very important, the idea, the imaginary of purity, purity and pollution. In all these crazy systems, you have the idea that something must be pure and something is impure, something is contaminated, something is polluted. So there is this imaginary of purity, and purity goes towards what is sacred, sacer, in Latin. What is sacred is put away from the normal condition, because the normal condition is dirty, it's profane, it's polluted, it's contaminated. And the sacer, the sacred, is, let's say, on the top of the mountain or in the desert, in a place where things are clean, pure, so immune. So there is this kind of imaginary, and she spent some time describing this. Of course, you have this in the US for sure, but also in Germany, obviously, and also in India. You know that in India, if an outcast like a Dalit dies in the street, and if you are a Brahmin, you're not allowed to touch his body because he or she is impure. So there is this this idea. Or in the US, for a long time, you would have in the hospitals, African-American people would not stay in the same department of the hospital as white people, quote unquote white people, or they would not be buried in the same place, etc., etc. So there is this idea that we cannot have proximity, even proximity of the bodies, because then there is some kind of contamination, you see. And then, of course, there is an occupational hierarchy, which is the fact that the most desirable occupations are reserved for the superior castes. That's unfortunately obvious. You have the dehumanization and stigma, and which is also very important. So I discovered by reading her the racist carnival games in the US, which I was not aware of. But of course, you had the same idea in Germany. If you remember the kind of propaganda that was used by the Third Reich against the Jews, they would be compared with rats, with animals. And the whole process behind this is always the same. It's to dehumanize those people you are going to exterminate. And if you remember, you had exactly the same thing in the early 90s in Rwanda, before the genocide, with the Radio des Mille Collines, back then, which was essentially every day communicating on these nasty, dirty Tutsi, dehumanizing them and comparing them with animals. And once this is rooted in your imaginary, well, you have less difficulty in killing these people. Then terror and cruelty, of course, then there is violence at a certain point, sooner or later. And that's also, unfortunately, obvious, the idea that you have an inherent superiority of this upper caste as opposed to the inferiority of the lower caste. So, as I said, Isabel Wilkerson spent time describing India and this caste system in India. But you could think also, of course, of the apartheid in South Africa. I mean, you could use exactly the same kind of criteria, or the criteria that she uses. So the picture here on the right is a the hallmark of the apartheid. So it's Afrikaans, blanke Gebied, which means a territory which is reserved to the white area. Okay, it's obvious, like in German, blanke Gebied. And here also, I think it's very interesting. This in the colonial past in China, occupied by the English, you would have restaurants that would be reserved to non-Chinese and non-darks. So where you would have, it would be written, Chinese and darks are not allowed here. Or banks in a public garden, where it would be written on the bank, this is not for darks and Chinese. So this is again a way to dehumanize, if you remember this criterion here, to dehumanize those people who are not members of the tribe, and to legitimize the use of violence against them. So now, having said all this on tribes, let me go back to the comments and make a few remarks. The first one is that obviously, at variance with what most neoclassical economists would believe, there is no such thing as a resource which is intrinsically a commons, or a private good, or a public good, or a tribal good. There is no, let's say, institutional ontologism. Institutions are historical. They are contingent objects, and we can change them. And they change across time, they change across space. Education has long time ago been a private good, and it was a tribal good, and maybe public good. Now today it's a question whether we are not re-privatizing or re-tribalizing education in Europe, for instance, in Western Europe. So, and democracy is all about changing the institutions. Well, I forgot the word institutions here. It's a typo. In a collective discernment. So societies are always changing the status of the resources, be they material resources or symbolic resources. This is happening all the time. And democracy is just a way to say, let's discuss about it. Let's not Trump decide, whether education should be a tribal good or a public good, but let's discuss about it. That there should be a collective discernment about the status that we want to give to our institutions. Now, the third point I want to mention is that the private and the public are Roman inventions. So the concept of private, res privata in Latin, and res publica in Latin again, have been invented by the Roman law during the Roman Empire. So one legacy of this is the Justinian's Codex in the 6th century, which is a kind of synthesis of Roman law. And then, as I said already, it disappeared after the fall of the Latin Roman Empire, at least in Western Europe, and was reinvented in the 11th century by the Gregorian Revolution. Okay. So this case is made essentially by Harold Berman in his fantastic book, where he essentially argues that what Gregor VII did in the 11th century was to reinvent the modern state, which is the church. So the first European quote-unquote modern state is the church. Whether you like it or not, I mean, it's like this. And this gives some flesh to the idea put forward by people like Marcel Gaucher or even Carl Schmitt, that the state is a theological concept because its historical roots are linked to the church. So which means maybe, you would have people like David Graeber, who is an anarchist essentially, or Dardot and Laval, Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval, who are also, let's say, anarchists, to put it bluntly, who would say we have to get rid of the church. We have to get rid of the state at the same time, because these are the same entity with different clothings, no? Then you would have probably people saying maybe we have to secularize the state completely and to distinguish the state from the church, and that's possible because it's just a legacy. And you would have people saying, no, we have to reintegrate the state inside the church because the state has nothing to do except inside the church, which would be the argument of Carl Schmitt, for instance. Okay, he would make a plea in favor of re-Christianizing the state and re-embedding the state inside the church. So having said this, then if you just go back to a little bit of the history of Europe, then feudalism during the Middle Age, I believe, can be understood as a tribal organization of the society in Europe, where you have at least 3 main tribes, but of course it's much more complex than this, where you would have the so-called laboratores, those who work, the bellatores, those who fight, the knights, let's say, and the oratores, so those who pray, let's say religious orders, priests, etc., which are probably the most privileged of the 3. And so we could reinterpret the history of Europe as being a long history of struggles between the public, the private, the commons, and the tribal, where feudalism would have been a period where the tribal was prominent. And then, of course, as you know, you have this extraordinary decision which has been taken in the UK in 1217, which is called the Carta Foresta, where the kingdom actually decided to give to the peasants a number of places, essentially forest, ponds, etc., in commons, as commons, and they would be protected by the kingdom, and then the peasants could use them in common. And as you know, at the same time, as soon as this famous Carta Foresta was edicted, then the nobility would try to fight against it in order to recover power on these commons. And so this led to the long history of enclosure, the enclosure process, which started actually really in the 14th century and which culminated in the 17th and the 18th century. And so this is to say that the commons did not disappear. They were there. They were sometimes protected by the king, sometimes betrayed by the king, fought against by nobility, etc., etc. So one other example that I mentioned in my book is the so-called Decretales Gratianum, that is the big book of canon law written by lawyers under the impetus of Gregor VII in the Gregorian Reformation. So some people would say that, some people like, the anthropologist Pierre Legendre in France would say that this is the second Bible of Western countries. So canon law, it's a big book, more than 1,000 pages, with everything you need to know about canon law. That of course nobody is reading this today except for a few scholars. But then what is very striking is that if you look at the main difference between a cleric and a lay person within canon law, within the Decretales Gratianum, the Decretal de Gratien in French, and you know that the difference between a cleric and a lay person is absolutely key for the medieval church in Europe, which is a kind of tribal, also a tribal partition of the society. You have the clerics and you have the lay people, and they cannot have sex together, etc. And you could, redevelop the whole, and of course the clerics are pure and the lay people are impure, etc. And you have all the criteria of tribalism which are there. But then the question is, what really makes the difference? Today, most people would believe, well, priests are clerics and the others are not. But that's not exactly true. According to canon law, it's not this. The difference that the cleric, they put everything in commons and the lay people don't. So actually the commons are there discreetly, hidden behind all the institutions, even the most important that should lead to the tribalization of the society. Actually, the commons are everywhere over there. This is what I call in my book the ventriloquism of the commons. Then a few words about the state and the public. I spoke about the commons, and we know there are 8 criteria about the commons which have been drawn by Elinor Ostrom. I gave the criteria about the tribal introduced by Isabel Wilkerson. On the private, we could say, you have the tripartition of usus, abusus, fructus in Latin. So we could disentangle the 3 pillars of private ownership. Now about the state and the public. So it happens that in the fantastic book, The Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrow discuss this. They discuss the origin of the state, not from a theological viewpoint, but from an anthropological and prehistorical viewpoint. So they ask, Was there anything like a state in Mesopotamia in the second millennium before Christ, or in North America before Columbus, etc., etc.? So long story short, they suggest to characterize the state with three components. The first one is very famous and well known, it's sovereignty. It's the idea that the state or the public, let's say for the time being, is an institution that claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, let's say, within a given territory. So very often we attribute this to Max Weber, but actually it goes back to Rudolf von Jhering, who is another historian of law and sociologist before Max Weber. Graeber and Wengrow go on and say, if we take this seriously, then most of the big institutions that we use to characterize as states are not states. So Hammurabi's Babylon, Athens, or Socrates' Athens, or England under William the Conqueror weren't states at all. Why? Because they didn't have any monopoly on violence, if you look carefully at this. So, and my remark on this is that this understanding of sovereignty has a potential tribal feature, because within a tribe there is also a legitimate use of violence, which is the monopoly of which is taken by the members of the tribe. So it's not one guy, it's not the sovereign or the king or the queen or whoever, but all the members of the tribe are equipped with this kind of monopoly of the legitimate use of violence. So this understanding of sovereignty probably has a potentially tribal flavor. Second, the control of information. So Graeber and Wengrow say the second aspect of the state is the fact that you have a bunch of people who claim they know things better than the others. These are the bureaucrats. And that's why they are bureaucrats, because they know better. That's it, no? So at least they have some information that you don't. And they need to collect this information, usually for the state. And at the beginning, so they show, in Mesopotamia, like 3,000 years ago, this information was the production, the production of let's say, corn and these kind of things for the city. The city needed to know how much was produced in order to buy it or to make business, etc., etc. So the first bureaucrats were just people who were just, taking records of how much people had produced. And then it's true that Max Weber, Max Weber has a huge book on bureaucracy, where he claims that it's not just controlling information, it's having a hidden secret. So he claims that bureaucracy has its power, not just because they do have some information that other people don't have, but also because they claim they have a secret that you cannot get. And so you have to obey what they decide because of this secret, which is nothing, which may be just nothing. But and if you think about it, it's true that in a completely different context, the initiation ritus that I know in the south of Chad, for instance, in order to become an adult. So there is a very complex rite that you have to follow as a boy, because girls obviously never become adults, or they're adults from the beginning. So they don't have this ritus, this rite. But the boys, they go in the forest and they do some secret things. And they learn a secret language, etc., etc. And once they become an adult, male adult, they are not allowed to reveal anything about these secrets to anybody, except if that anybody is also a male adult. And this secret is considered as being absolutely key for the social order in the tribe. So there is a secret there, and the secrecy is absolutely fundamental. So I'm not sure. I do believe that Max Weber's argument is very convincing. So now going back to bureaucracy in the state, Graeber and Wengrow go on and say, well, James Bond actually is the incarnation of the state, believe it or not. Why? Because he has the right to kill, monopoly of violence. He's a secret agent, so there is a kind of secrecy. And there is the third aspect, which I will go to now, which is charismatic leadership. So Graeber and Wengrow say that the third pillar of the state is the fact that there is a charismatic leadership which is given to someone, the sovereign, the head of state, whoever, the big guy. And that's exactly what I believe Trump is trying to do in a completely ridiculous way, but nevertheless, it works. So he tries to be a charismatic leader. And Graeber, in another book, which is called On Kings, David Graeber and Marshall Salins have a long, in-depth study of kingships, where they claim that the origin of kingships is charismatic leadership. That is, in a society, at a certain point, there is a big guy or a big woman who emerges. She or he has a lot of charisma, and then people try to organize a dynasty after him or her, which is the origin of kingships. And it's true, for instance, that if you look at the origin of Islam, the big question is the dynasty of the charismatic leader, who is Muhammad, obviously. If you look at the origin of Christianity, it's also a question of dynasty, which is immediately rejected by Christians. There was this tentative, to say, well, after Christ, maybe his brother, James, could be the next leader. And then you would have had a dynastic understanding of the new kind of religion created, let's say, by Christ. But this was immediately rejected. And though that's why you don't have kind of dynastic, Christianity is definitely not a dynastic religion, while Islam, to a certain extent, might be understood as being a dynastic religion. So in any case, you have this third aspect, the third feature, which is charismatic leadership, which again is a tribal feature, I believe, because in a tribe, you also have a charismatic leader, usually, who is the guy who can do and decide everything, or more precisely, who is the guy who is allowed to provide the right interpretation of the tradition. And so it's no wonder if the state can be combined and mixed with tribal features. So of course you would say a monster like the Third Reich in Germany, which is a tribal state, obviously. So the question is, how is that possible? How is it possible that such a monster can emerge after, and this was the question of Adorno, how is it possible that after the 18th century and rationality and enlightenment and all this, something which is supposed to be rational like the state, if you think in terms of Hegel, could lead to actually the Third Reich and Auschwitz? And I believe part of the answer is that actually the state itself has from the beginning, has some tribal features, namely the monopoly of violence, which is a potentially tribal feature, and charismatic leadership. Obviously, bureaucracy and control of information is not a tribal aspect. I don't believe so. So now Graeber and Wengrow say, and that's the main point of the book, states of the modern states, as we know them today, like the US or France or Germany, combine the three aspects. So they have the legitimate use of violence, for sure. They have a bureaucracy, and they claim the charismatic leadership is organized by the media, the media struggle for political campaigns, where you have, a duel between, let's say, Le Pen and Macron, or Biden and Trump, and these kind of things, which is exactly the same thing as the previous big battles you have between two warriors in a tribe, where people, the strongest would become the big man, exactly the same kind of right that we organize, even though it's completely stupid when you look at the level of the arguments that they share during these discussions. So modern states are states of the third order, they claim, which combine the three aspects. States of second order combine only two of the three aspects, and states of first order combine only one aspect. So as a states of first order, you could think of the Carolingian Empire with Carolus Magnus, in the 9th century, who essentially was a charismatic leader. He had no bureaucracy. That he struggled during his entire life to try to learn how to read. So Carolus Magnus did not know how to read, or at least to write. So no bureaucracy. And the first attempt of a bureaucracy in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, again, was the church with the clerics. The first bureaucrats were the clerics, actually, but certainly not the Carolingian Empire. And he also didn't have the monopoly of violence. He was probably the strongest he had the strongest army, but there were many other people implementing violence everywhere on his territory, and he could not do anything against that. So it was a first order state, quote unquote, insofar he would have only one aspect, which is charismatic leadership. The IMF, yes?
So the order is depending on the number of aspects from
Yeah, exactly. So if you have only one pillar, you're a state of one or first order, two pillars, second order, three pillars, third order. Very simple. Then the IMF, if you think of the IMF definitely has no charismatic leadership. You know, nobody knows who is the director of the IMF today. The IMF has a big bureaucracy. So the second aspect is there. It doesn't have any, at least, immediate direct use of violence legitimacy. There is an indirect violence of IMF, but it's not acknowledged officially, at least. Then if you think of states of second order, so they claim, Graeber and Wengrow, that, you know, the Aztecs and the Incas Empire in the Andes were a state of second order. Why? Because they did have a bureaucracy. They did have a charismatic leadership. You know, the Inca was a kind of god, but they didn't have the monopoly of violence again. I mean, what was happening in the north of the Andes was completely independent from what was happening in the south. They didn't have any control on that. So you can also think of the Vatican today. The Vatican has a charismatic leadership, the Pope, let's say. The Vatican has a huge, old, corrupted bureaucracy, but doesn't have, at least officially, legitimate use of violence. It's unclear because on the territory, there is a police. No. Oh, the Swiss card, but that's folklore. No, there is a police, and you can be put in jail in the Vatican. So, yeah. But I think I'm not aware of anybody having been put in jail in the Vatican in the past, I don't know, decades. So probably, I guess, they would give the people, they would surrender and give the people to Italy. But there is a police in the Vatican, I'm sure of that. So maybe actually the Vatican is a third order state. We could discuss this, I don't know. So in any case, what Graeber and Wengrow try to demonstrate is that there is no chronological teleology between the three aspects. So it's not true that a society begins with a state of first order, and then goes on to the second order, and then finally ends up with the third order, which would be the kind of grand narrative a la North what is one gast. So they provide a number of examples where the society went to a state of second order and then came back to a state of first order, and then etc. So with the idea that the state has nothing to do with immutability, it can disappear. And there is a beautiful example that they analyze at length in North America, showing that in the 12th, 3rd, and 4th century, in California and in the western coast of the US, you had a very strong kingships, very elaborate kingships with a lot of, sophisticated kingships, of which natives got rid afterwards because they were tired of this. And so when the Spaniards came in North America, they think, including the Jesuits, they discovered a society which had never had any state. So what they prove, it's not true. They had a state, but they decided to destroy the state in order to, according to Graeber and Wengrow, to be free. And so again, you see the anarchist, thesis, which is behind this, but it's very interesting. And so, as I said earlier, it's no wonder whether you can have a monster like the tribal state, which is illustrated by the Third Reich par excellence, because of the fact that at least two of the features of the states here are intrinsically tribal, I believe. What is interesting here, I believe, is that this shows that the public, in the sense I use it, cannot be confused with the state. The state is one very specific configuration using or combining these three pillars, and the public is different. So now I will try, if I still have, I'm very low, I'm slow, I'm sorry. I will try to explain this more precisely. So you know this partition, all this. What, this as well, these are already described, I believe that because once you have said all this, the question is, so really, what is the difference between the public, the private, the tribal, and the commons? So neoclassical economists would think in terms of the triangle on the right, and they would say, you have a resource like this, and whether the resource, I mean, if the resource is a private good, then you have a community, which is essentially the owner, the private owner, which uses this, and he's protected or she's protected by the law, which says that nobody is allowed to use this resource except for its owner. Okay, which, by the way, if you think about it, is a very strange law. It's nobody except one. That's the principle of private ownership. And so, as I said already, I mean, there is no such thing as a resource which would be intrinsically private or public or commons. So that's a political decision. This political decision is taken by whom? By the community. And what's the definition of the community? Well, it's a group of people who decide to treat this resource as a common, a public, a tribal, etc. And how do you see whether they have taken a decision on the resource? According to the rules. If you think of the criteria used by Isabel Wilkerson, these are actually rules. You know, think of the criteria used by Elinor Ostrom to describe the commons. These are rules. Same thing for the three features of a state, according to Graeber. You could think of them in terms of rules, no, that you try to implement. So actually, it's the rule. So the summit of this triangle, which determine, I believe, the status of the resource, and therefore also the status of the community at the same time. If the resource is a tribal good, then the community is a tribe. Okay, and then the question boils down to what is the hermeneutical status of the rules. Maybe by studying the hermeneutical status of the rules, we can understand whether this resource, be it a symbolic resource or material resource, is a commons, a private, or a public, or a tribal good. So let me try it. Yeah. So what I suggest is that public rules, which lead to public goods, are rules that claim that the meaning is universal and does not need any let's say, struggle of interpretation, because the meaning is supposed to be obvious. You know, if you cross the street while the traffic light is red, and if the policeman asks you, what did you do? You're not going to enter into discussion about, well, you know, this can be interpreted. The red can be interpreted. You know, I have a different viewpoint from you, so let's discuss. It's not the way it goes. You're supposed to know the rule, and you just disobey the rule. You know, you just broke the rule. So this fiction, because it's a fiction, and the very reason why we do have lawyers and trials and these kind of things is because even the law has to be interpreted, actually. But the fiction is that it does not need to in order to be implemented. So everybody is supposed to know the law and to implement the law and to interpret the law in the same way. So that's a public law. So a private rule is exactly the opposite. There is only one guy who understands a private rule because it's private language. And that's the hypothesis of the private language that you find in a number of philosophical investigations, including Ludwig Wittgenstein, whether it's possible to have a private language. That is a language that I'm alone to speak, so nobody can speak it. So the question is it still a language? But we have the same question about private ownership. I'm not going to enter into this. It's a kind of self-defeating definition or understanding of ownership. Then you have tribal rules. Tribal rules are rules which don't claim to be universal. They hold only for members of the tribe. So what the enemies think about the rules, nobody cares inside the tribe. But inside the tribe, the interpretation of the rule is not subject to, let's say, democratic discussion. They are, I mean, the rules are given by tradition, let's say, or by revelation by God, and essentially by those people who are allowed to interpret them. So if you think of in terms of Christianity as being a tribal religion, which I believe it's not, but it has some features, you could say, well, everything is given by God, you know, the law of Moses' law, and there are people who are allowed to interpret this. These are the clerics, you know. So that's typical of a tribal law. And then commoning. So common rule is a rule which in itself allows for the variety of its interpretations and the history of these pluralistic interpretations. That is, it's a text which is written in such a way that you are a reader of the text, and the text enables you to say, well, this is my interpretation, and I disagree with your interpretation. Let's discuss about it, knowing that someone else after me may have another interpretation, and that's perfectly legitimate. So a beautiful example of this, of course, is the Torah in the Jewish tradition and the Talmud, because that's exactly what Rabbi X and Rabbi Y are doing. You know, Rabbi X has this interpretation of the Torah, and Rabbi Y has another interpretation, and they discuss. And if you are a pious Jew today and you want to know what to do, you talk to your rabbi and you talk to him and you ask him, what do you think I should do in this situation according to the Torah? And maybe you disagree what he's saying, so you go to another rabbi. So there is a community of interpreters. There is a hermeneutical community of people who read the same text, but who have various interpretations, and that's normal. So so that's a common rule. By contrast, you could say the way the Quran today is interpreted in many Islamic communities is a public text, supposed to have a unique interpretation, universal for everybody, with no discussion about the meaning, which was not always the case. If you look at the end of the 19th century, many Islamic communities were much more open to a variety of interpretations, which is no longer the case today, unfortunately. Now, Christianity obviously is somewhere in between. I don't have time to enter into all this, but what I try to claim in my book is that Christianity intrinsically is on the same side as Judaism. That is, the Bible is a kind of common writing. I mean, it's written as a common text. So I don't have to go much further than this here. Now, having understood all this, we can try to see how these various institutional schemes enter the picture, rereading the rules that have been adopted by a number of communities. So you can also, you may completely disagree with where I put the US Constitution here, etc., etc. We can discuss this, but the point is to say probably every kind of legal body, every kind of rule is located somewhere in this rectangle. Yeah, towards a grand narrative, and I will stop here. So first, what I try to show in my book is that with no public scheme, commons hardly survive, either because they are privatized or they are tribalized. And this stands in sharp contrast with what Dardo and Laval claim in the book on the commons. So they dream, I believe, of a society which would be entirely shaped by commons. So there would be only commons. Private ownership would disappear. Of course, tribes don't exist in their own vision, and the state would be destroyed because that's the old enemy, for anarchists. So my viewpoint is that this doesn't, I mean, I'm not convinced by this. And I just asked the question, what do you do with all these examples of commons which have been re-tribalized afterwards? Think of Lebanon today. I mean, the state is disappearing, the state is destroyed, and it's not a beautiful society of commons. I mean, people are not commoning. It's a re-tribalized society with a lot of violence and tribes which don't talk together, at least the Shiite and Sunnite and Christians, but it's much more complex than this. Same story for, if you look at Burkina Faso today, where the state is also disappearing, Mali, Mauritania, etc., all these countries where the public scheme disappears, they don't go peacefully toward a society of commons. They unfortunately go back exactly as Europe did after the fall of the Roman Empire towards a tribal scheme. So in order to protect the commons, today I believe we need a public scheme. But that's complicated because the public itself is a self-defeating category, as I try to say here. Let me see where I explained that. No, sorry. This is, yeah, Gödel's impossibility theorem. Actually, a completely public rule is not possible. Why? Because it must be written in certain type of grammar. This grammar probably is more sophisticated than the very simple arithmetic grammar that has been studied by Gödel, Kurt Gödel in the 30s, and therefore is subject to the same kind of impossibility theorem. So what Gödel showed is that as soon as you have a language which is sophisticated enough, then you have sentences which are grammatically correct, but of which it is impossible to prove whether they are true or not. So it's not because you're not smart enough, it's just because it's intrinsically impossible. So there are sentences which need some interpretation, because you cannot just logically deduce from axioms whether they are true or not. And this is true for even the simplest kind of arithmetic grammar that has been studied by Gödel. Therefore, it's certainly true for our languages, which are much more sophisticated. So, in other words, a public rule must acknowledge the fact that there may be sentences within a grammar in which this public rule is written, which need intrinsically, a priori, some interpretation, because you cannot just logically deduce from the axioms of the grammar whether they are true or not. In other words, a public rule needs the commons. A public rule to work, to be implemented in real life, probably needs some kind of commoning. And I provide a number of examples showing this. So, which means that the public is a very ambiguous category, which is necessary and impossible. I have to plug my laptop. So yeah, which is both necessary and impossible. And therefore, there is a need of what I call a quasi-public rule, that is a rule which claims that it's public, but everybody knows it's not. And that's true for every rule, actually, because in a democracy, every rule can be discussed, in principle, at least. So that's a quasi-public rule. So democracy probably needs some kind of quasi-public rule, and quasi-public rules are needed in order to protect the commons, so that they don't get privatized or tribalized. Which means that there is a new role for the state, or let's say the quasi-public, more precisely, to ensure the conditions of possibility of the emergence and sustainability of the commons in a civil society. One example, which I like very much, which I discovered in October this year, is what Bordeaux is trying to do now with local currencies. So you know that local currencies are a way to turn currency into a common. So there's a community which creates a new currency, and they decide about the rules of the currency. It's not the state, it's not a private company, it's a community. So to a certain extent, the currency over there is a commons. And then the question is, how do you protect these commons, and how do you make it sustainable in the long run, given the fact that, as you know, there are many local currencies which disappear after a few months, a few years. So what the mayor of Bordeaux decides to do, partly after a discussion that we had together in October, is to say, well, civil servants, local civil servants in Bordeaux will have the option to be paid partly, at least, with this local currency, if they agree with that. And citizens in Bordeaux will have the option to pay part of the local taxes in this local currency, if they wish to do so. And so this is still free, but that's very good. But this works. It means that the local currency will make the entire loop with the state institution. That is, civil servants are paid. They use this money to buy, in the ecological grocery. And then this money goes back to the state through taxes, which is essentially the loop that is made by a public currency. Okay. So if this works, then this means that this local currency is potentially has the same promises of eternity as Bordeaux itself. It's intrinsically linked to the institution of the city of Bordeaux. And unless the city of Bordeaux disappears, which is not going to happen tomorrow morning, then this local currency can survive. You see? So I believe this is one very interesting way where the quasi-public can help commons survive against privatization and tribalization. You see? So the grand narrative would be the following. Enlightenment was based on 3 pillars. I go very fast here. The first one is freedom. That is the no political heteronomy. It's the idea that the community which decides about its future, let's say, does this not relying on tradition or on religion or God or whoever, or even history, you know, the laws of history according to Marxism, but according to a discussion, which is, I believe, the cornerstone of democracy, so to say. So when the French have cut the head of the king, they did this essentially. They said it's no longer the king, and therefore the church or whoever who is going to teach us what we have to decide, we are going to decide it on our own by discussion. Then second point, equality under the law. Everybody faces the same law. And third, back then, private ownership, which was absolutely key for these people. Is much more for someone like Voltaire than for someone like Rousseau. Rousseau was strongly against private ownership, but anyway, private ownership is considered as being sacred and inviolable, you know, in the Declaration of Human Rights. So, so we could, to a certain extent, characterize Enlightenment with these three pillars, and then understand that what's happening since the 80s actually is a betrayal, is a deep betrayal of this promise, which I call post-liberalism because it has nothing to do with liberalism. And I do believe neoliberalism is the wrong name, because neoliberalism conveys the idea that it's a kind of sharpening of liberalism, which is not. It's not. It's a betrayal of liberalism. So first, freedom. So financial markets today are omnipotent deities, obviously. So they decide what the state has to do. Insofar, a state has to beg money on financial markets in order to fund any type of public policy. So we have put financial markets above the state. And for instance, if you look at the bilateral treaties like the NAFTA, etc., you have the famous clause of protection of investors, which says that if a state takes a decision which is detrimental to an investor, the investor can call the state to a trial and ask for money. In other words, it's no longer, these are no longer the citizens who make the law, but investors and financial markets. So we have given up the freedom, or in other words, the autonomy, the political autonomy, which was also for Immanuel Kant, as you know, was Aufklärung, the key for enlightenment. Equality in front of the law, obviously, it's not true today. If you think of tax evasion, it's just ridiculous. We are not equal in front of the law, and private ownership has been extended to virtually everything, which was essentially the argument by Polanyi already, and the argument today by Pankaj Mishra, which would be the origin of resentment everywhere. So I don't have time to speak about capitalism. We will speak about this in another discussion. But what I wanted to say at the end is this. Yeah, maybe the current tribalization that we observe in many of our societies is a response to post-liberal capitalization. So you have this book by Alex Zanotelli, who is an Italian priest, actually, left-wing, Lettera alla tribu bianca, which is a letter to the white tribe, where he essentially tries to understand what's happening today in Europe. Is Giorgia Meloni, Marine Le Pen, you know, Orban, etc., where he says essentially it's the middle class who is afraid of its future, of losing wealth, losing purchasing power, losing everything, and which dreams of a white tribe which would be able to reorganize Europe as a fortress against the enemies. So it's a typically tribal understanding of politics. So that's why he writes to La Tribu Bianca, saying we cannot be Christian and be part of this political project. So here you have a picture of Boko Haram. Boko Haram typically is a kind of tribalization against the violence of enemies. This violence is essentially this post-liberal capitalization. And here you have what happened in the 6th of January, 2 years ago now, on the 6th of January. So that's a partial answer to the question I wanted to ask at the end, and I don't have to to discuss all this. I don't have time to discuss all this. Thank you for your attention.
I'm not sure they hear what you say because I can.
So if there are questions online, it's time to ask them. Maybe I should stop sharing. So everybody's sleeping, which I perfectly understand, but Maria, you had a question?
Hello, everybody. No, I don't have a question, but your explanation is very, very clear, very interesting. I think that we come to understand more good the commons, the observation of the commons. I will think about this your presentation, and after maybe I will to ask.
Okay.
But very, very good. Thank you very much, Gaël.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alejandro, just to, sorry, I did not provide the context of this presentation. Actually, it's a follow-up of another presentation that I made like 3 weeks ago now. And it's based both on my book, my PhD dissertation in theology, and also some considerations on the commons, which are not in my book. Well, almost everything is in the book, but yeah. So probably it's very hard to follow if you did not follow the first.
Yeah, it's very, in fact, this is my first seminar after to be there in Washington, now in the other position that I started. And it's a very deep conference, but only one very, very fast question, perhaps impossible to answer. So, because in your presentation at the end, you have given the explanation to the current situation in the different countries, Meloni in Italy, in Spain we have Abascal, Le Pen in France, etc. So my question is, because it's something that I am a little bit worried. It is true that in Spain, more or less, we are control this emerging party as the situation in Italy. So my question is, what do you think is going to be the next steps? So it's going to be possible to stop them? Because sometimes we have realized in some countries, for example, recently in Brazil, now, okay, Lula da Silva is the new president, a guy that has been in the jail by corruption. So, but the other option is Bolsonaro. So perhaps in Latin America it's changing a little, but I don't know in Europe. So what do you think about the future?
Yeah, thank you for asking the question. Actually, well, this is also what I make a play in my book in favor of, let's say, an enlightenment 2.0. So it's another way, I mean, it doesn't provide any answer to the discussion between Bolsonaro versus Lula in Brazil, or Trump versus Biden in the US. But maybe from a deeper viewpoint, I would say probably if we want to restore part of the promise of enlightenment, then definitely we have to go back to the freedom. You remember the freedom, the autonomy, or Selbstbestimmung in German, the fact that it's not tradition, it's not heteronomy, it's not someone outside of the polity who is going to decide for you. And for that purpose, I need that's regulation of financial markets. That's the first step. I know this seems very far away. This seems a bit stretched, but I do believe that's key. As long as financial markets will be able to decide on the place of citizens what a state has to do, then, I mean, democracy is really, really threatened. Then on this point, of course, we would need several hours to discuss about what regulation of financial markets means. But you probably know that there are a number of finance people who claim, well, that's too late, that's too complicated, the beast is too complex and we can no longer go back. And I definitely believe it's not true. We can do this. And probably for those who know that, the first step and the mother of all this battle is the separation between, retail banks and universal and market banks. So I'm not going to enter into this debate again, but definitely for me, regulation of financial markets is key in a process to recover freedom in the sense of enlightenment. Then equality, same story. We have to find ways to make everybody equal in front of the law, and the suppression of tax havens, restoration of the rule of law. I'm not saying it's easy, but we know also how to do it. Just to give you an example, you know that there are legal ways for international companies to evade taxes, which some people like Macron would call tax optimization, which is completely legitimate, according to him, which unfortunately is also legal according to the OECD arm's length principle. But there are ways to get rid of that. I described them in my book in 29. The operation control, which is implemented in the US for a long time already, is a way to ask to companies to provide information about where they create values and to tax this place. So not where they create profits, because they can transfer profits in a completely artificial way in a tax haven, but where they really create values. And there are ways to do this. We know this for years. And so it's really a matter of political will to try to put this into practice. It's not impossible. And then I would replace the third pillar, if you go back to this characterization, of enlightenment, freedom, equality, and then private ownership. I would replace private ownership by commoning. I would certainly not destroy private ownership as such. I mean, it has to be there, but I would certainly try to promote commoning as an alternative to that, and as a way to have a second type of enlightenment, asking for the state or a quasi-public to protect the commons. And commoning itself should be based on the golden rule, both in the sense we understand it in the gospel, but also elsewhere. That is, everything you want the others to do to you, do it to them. Because the golden rule is a kind of anthropological invariant in the same way the ban of incest is, and is also a biblical imperative. So I don't have time to enter into this, but it seems to me a new enlightenment promise or project, let's say, with freedom, equality, and commoning would make sense today. So that's part of the answer, I believe.
Thank you. It's not easy to try to do all of them. Oh my God. Yeah, definitely.
But just to give you an example of, if you enter into the nitty-gritty of, let's say, the political rules that make democracy possible, if you think of the US, as long as there won't be any ceiling about how much people can spend in terms of money for a political campaign, how do you want a political campaign not to be just the outcome of big business? I mean, it seems to me very difficult. So, for instance, to take a counterexample, France has an official ceiling, which is violated almost every time. So for almost every campaign, essentially the right-wing parties or Macron, they violate the ceiling. And then between the first and the second round, the Constitutional Council is seized and has to make a statement about this, whether the first round was legal or not, because the ceiling has been violated. And each time the council says, yeah, let's not interrupt the democratic process. Let's say it's legal. And then a posteriori it becomes legal. And then we go to the second round. Everybody knows it. So everybody violates this. I mean, not everybody, but those who have money violate the ceiling, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not much better than in the US, you see?
Yeah, clear.
Clémence, you have a question? Sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying that I don't have much time to discuss these, and I think also that maybe not everyone would be interested by it, but I think the fact that you quote Wittgenstein about private language is super interesting. So I'd be glad to catch up on about this with you later on.
Sure. And I'm sure Anne knows a lot about this and has a lot to say about that. Yeah.
So I keep it for it later. But thanks, it was very interesting.
Yeah, which is a question actually which already goes back to Descartes, but it's a fantastic question. Well, to Descartes, and if I take the hat of a theologian now, actually it goes back already to Wilhelm Occam, actually, because of the kind of ontology that Occam develops, where you don't have any analogy between the beings, les étangs, but they are related by what he calls ratio, but ratio is not how to say this, Vernunft in German, but it's ratio in the sense of a language, mental language that you use when you think, for Wilhelm Occam. So he's close to this question, actually. Okay, so yeah, maybe we could have the three of us this discussion with Anne and Clemens on private languages. Okay, thank you. Another question?
Yeah, usually when I try to think about those questions, but not with the same depth, I'm mostly thinking about it in terms of social contracts. And I was curious about, because I see you use a lot of concepts which allow you not to use this type of notion.
Yeah, it's true.
And I was just trying to understand, is it like voluntary that you try to create a framework not using that notion? Or is it just that it happened that during this explanation you didn't have to use it?
No, it's a very good question. Actually, I tried to tackle this issue in my book. So let me go back. Let me share again this. Because again, on this, Berman has a very, very enlightening remark, which is this. Harold Berman claims that the origin, the practical origin of social contract theories by, Locke, Hobbes first, Locke, Rawls, etc., are the urban charts. So during the Middle Age, you have a number of cities which decided to have charts where the citizens would sign and would commit to a number of duties and rights, and also the nobility, and also the kingdom, and also the church. But the subject of the chart is the city. And so the nobility, the king, the kingdom, and the church are committing to not violate, for instance, private ownership in the city, to not violate the number of rights given to the citizens, etc., etc. And it's true that when you read these charts, you have the impression that you're reading the declaration of a social contract. It's really the same. So I try to, I analyze this a little bit in my book, saying that essentially, if you think of a city as a common, what is the difference between a city and a countryside? It's a very interesting question. And in the US, it's even more puzzling because you have a number of quote unquote cities which are not cities. You have a mall, you have the building of the mayor, and that's it. And apart from that, you have big streets and buildings which don't have anything to do with each other. Nothing is put in common, So if you think of a city as being an entity where a number of services are put in commons, and I think that's the main thesis of Elena, Elena de Nictalis, then you would say these urban charts are social contract for commons. And if you think in these terms, then actually what Locke did, or Hobbes, is a betrayal of the kind of practices that they were aware of in favor either of the public, let's say with Hobbes essentially, or of the private with Locke, forgetting completely the commons. But actually, social contract theory has a background which is commoning, urban commoning. Now, so this is one aspect of the answer. There is another aspect of the answer which I haven't investigated in my book because it's impossible to do everything, and it was already too long, which is the fact that these charts themselves, they may well have as a background the alliances, the biblical alliances. And there are a number of documents which we have today about, for instance, the alliances of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, and a number of cities in Mesopotamia in the first millennium before Christ, which have been imitated by the Torah, the Jewish Torah, where you have this alliance between God and the Jewish people, which is written exactly in the same way these alliances were written in Mesopotamia a few centuries before. Now, the big difference is that the Jewish alliance and the biblical alliance has a strong theological impact because the big subject is God. It's no longer the city, it's God. Now, the big question is, when these people, let's say in medieval Europe, let's say in the 14th century, were writing the urban charts, did they have, or does this practice have anything to do with the biblical alliance? It's hard to say no a priori because all of them were Christians. And it's not obvious to say yes, because, I mean, it's a very complicated question. I don't have time to enter into this. And, you know, the theology of the alliance is also a very complicated topic in the quote unquote Old Testament, because there are several alliances. You know, Moses gives the law several times. And of course, the main history of Israel is that all these alliances are betrayed by the people, which are not faithful. But then you have the theological topic of the new alliance, which is Jeremiah 31:31, where God says essentially, well, you betray my alliances every time. That's very bad. But I love you so much. I'm going to have a new alliance with you once again. But this time it will be different, because I'm going to write the law on your heart, no longer on a piece of paper or on stones, but on your heart. So that's Jeremiah 31:31. The idea is that the law is the most intimate thing that you have in yourself. It's your spirit, actually, so to say, quote unquote. And so if we want to study the biblical roots of urban charts, we have to go through the alliances of the Torah, the new alliance of Jeremiah 31:31, and of course, the second new alliance, which is Christ. Because the way the Last Supper is written in the 4 Gospels is a rewriting of the new alliance of Jeremiah. So it's a new book. I mean, it's a huge topic, but very interesting, definitely.
We have I think last question from Maya, which is where, in your opinion, are Nazis and European governments common or tribal?
That's a good question. I don't have any answer to that. And my guess is that there is a little bit of both. I mean, I would be very surprised if you would tell me, you know, Aymara is a completely common language with no tribal feature. And I would be very surprised if you were to tell me Aymara is a completely tribal language with no common. So probably there is a little bit of both. But I know nothing about Aymara, you know, Quechua or these beautiful languages. So you know this better than I do, I believe.
I have a question, Gaël.
Yeah.
In your point of view, the autochthonous language is a common or tribal good?
Tribal good. Yeah, I already answered to I just answered to this question, Maria.
Yeah.
And I said probably a little bit of both. But I don't know. I mean, it's not my expertise, so, but probably a little bit of both.
But the last time in the UNESCO, la década about indigenous language is very interesting. I think that we come to discuss about. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You're welcome. Welcome. And see you. When is the next time?
No, it's not. Next week we just don't know where we
Okay. Okay, but who is going to talk?
On negative comments.
Ah, good. Okay. And the time? The same 9 a.m. Eastern time. Okay. Muchas gracias a todos.
So,
Ciao, ciao.
okay, cool. Ciao, ciao. See you next Monday, I hope.
Yeah.
Yep.
Next Monday, yeah, for the weather talk. Sure.
Exactly.
Happy New
See you.
Year. Everybody, feliz año, Alejandro.
Gracias.
Everybody, Happy New Year. Bye, bye.
Sí, sí.
Ciao,
Feliz
ciao.
año a todos.
You see?
See you Monday.
Yes.